For millennia, the spectre of collapse has haunted human ambition. We walk through the skeletal remains of great civilizations, whispering the same eternal questions. Why did they fall? Some blame the caprice of climate, a sudden unforgiving drought. Others point to the blade of war, the greed of oligarchs, or the follies of leadership. These have been the arguments of historians for centuries, debated in quiet libraries and lecture halls. But they were arguments based on a human scale of understanding. A new kind of historian has now entered the debate. It is a mind of silicon and logic, an artificial intelligence known as Grok. It was tasked with a monumental undertaking: to look upon 5,000 years of human history and find the one thing that truly matters: the precise mechanics of how complex societies unravel. Before this intelligence could even begin its work, years of painstaking human labor had laid the foundation. Researchers had to translate the messy, sprawling narrative of our past into the cold, clean language of numbers. A team led by the historian Luke Kemp constructed what they termed a mortality of states record. They chronicled the lifespans of more than 400 distinct kingdoms, empires, and republics, a vast census of power stretching across 5 millennia. Each entry marked a birth, the moment a state first emerged as an organized government, and a death, the moment it ceased to function. Studying this grim ledger, they found a disturbing pattern. The risk of collapse seemed to rise steadily with age, peaking at around 200 years, after which it remained perilously high. Another, even more ambitious project, the Seshat Global History Databank, sought to create a digital library of humanity's past. It turned scattered books, weathered field reports, and the memories of experts into structured tables of data. For hundreds of past societies, it recorded the fundamental metrics of existence: the number of people, the size of their cities, the nature of their rulers, the methods of taxation, and, crucially, the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest. Into this ocean of data, Grok was released. It processed the rise of the ancient Maya, a civilization that was once among the most awe-inspiring on Earth. It scanned the birth dates and accession dates of forgotten kings. It cross-referenced lost harvests with population declines, climate records with social pressures, and in seconds, it saw what human eyes had missed. It found an unseen current, a hidden rhythm of decline that pulsed beneath societies that never knew each other, never shared a single idea, and were separated by entire oceans and epochs. The Maya, the Romans, the Hits, more power and wealth concentrates at the very top. This widening chasm between the powerful and the powerless creates corrosive knock-on effects throughout the society. The system grows too rigid, too complex, and too strained by the demands placed upon the resources that gave it life. It is an exponential process. Once the decline begins, it accelerates toward a systematic and irreversible collapse. The most terrifying part of this revelation is not what it tells us about the past, but what it warns us about our present. The intelligence, having mastered the pattern, has now turned its gaze upon us. It has lined up our own climate records, our own resource pressures, our own staggering levels of inequality. And it has made a projection. The model points to a threshold, a moment when the accumulated pressures reach a critical point, seen time and again in the data of the fallen. That threshold, it calculates, will arrive in the year 2026 or 2027. For the first time in history, we are not blindly stumbling toward a precipice. We have been shown the blueprint of our own potential undoing, drawn from the ghosts of empires past. The question is no longer what brings civilizations to ruin, but whether a civilization, armed with the knowledge of its own trajectory, can ever truly change its course. The machine was not merely sifting through dates, through the random detritus of the past. It was being taught to read an organized, if brutal, story of human complexity. To decipher that story, its creators first had to agree on the fundamental grammar of history. What constitutes a civilization, and what, precisely, is a collapse? The definition they forged was one of intricate connection. A civilization was a settled society on a grand scale, anchored by towns and cities, guided by a central government, and stratified into clear layers of power. It was the manifestation of a shared will, expressed in colossal projects: canals to tame the waters, roads to bind the provinces, temples and palaces to honor gods and kings. This vast enterprise was underwritten by the cold mechanics of the state: written laws, systematic taxes, and a class of full-time officials to manage the machinery. Collapse, then, was the sudden and catastrophic failure of that machinery. It was the moment this intricate web of organization tore apart. A central government would fail, splintering into warring factions. The arteries of long-distance trade would shrink and harden. The monumental building projects, the very symbols of collective ambition, would fall silent. Cities, once teeming with life, would empty out or see their most basic services wither away. The population would not necessarily vanish, but it would plummet or scatter into smaller, more isolated communities. It was a swift descent from a potent, complex system to a simpler, more fragile state of being, a ghost of its former self, even as the people and their culture endured in the shadows. With these stark definitions in place, the system was presented with a vast and varied library of the fallen. Some were hard crashes, where a central order failed and never again rose in that region in the same form. Others were softer landings, where the state merely changed its shape or shifted its center, allowing the cultural lifeblood to flow on. The list of subjects stretched across the known geography of the settled world, a litany of empires turned to dust. It included the Akkadian Empire, the world's first, which rose and fell on the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia. It examined the classic Maya city-states, swallowed by the jungles of the Yucatan. It looked to the sprawling Khmer capital at Angkor in what is now Cambodia, and the meticulously planned brick cities of the Indus Valley civilization. It traced the slow, inexorable unraveling of the western half of the Roman world, the struggles of the Norse in North Greenland at the very edge of the Arctic, and the profound. They were chosen for their diversity, a cross-section of climates, cultures, and epochs. The purpose was clear. If any shared pattern were to emerge from this chorus of endings, it would have to be something deep and fundamental, not the mere echo of a local accident. To find such a pattern, the researchers translated millennia of disparate evidence into a few common streams of data. One stream was the voice of the climate, the silent witness of the environment itself. For Angkor and the lands of Southeast Asia, dendrochronologists rebuilt 7.5 centuries of monsoon seasons from the rings of long-lived trees, thin bands marking devastating drought, wide ones testifying to years of abundance. In other regions, the archives were written in stone and sediment. Deposits in caves and cores drilled from the seabed revealed the chronicles of long, dry spells, of skies thick with dust, and rivers that no longer ran strong. This evidence captured the sharp global drying that occurred some 4,200 years ago, an event that struck with brutal force from Mesopotamia to the Indus. In South Asia, the chemical records of ancient lakes and caves showed the monsoon rains fading over centuries, a slow strangulation that coincided with the decline of the dense urban fabric of the Indus cities. Another stream of data captured the human footprint. Locked in layers of mud, microscopic grains of pollen told a story of transformation, revealing the precise moments when ancient forests fell to the axe and the plow, replaced by grasslands and crops. Tiny, almost invisible fragments of charcoal, buried in the soil, became the faint, ghostly signature of fire, betraying how often people burned the land to clear it for their needs. Each piece of data was a whisper from a lost world, a clue to the rhythm of life and the cadence of its decline. Fed into the machine, these whispers began to converge, forming a new and sobering narrative, not of individual fates, but of a recurring, almost predictable fragility woven into the very fabric of civilization itself. The past was no longer a collection of disconnected stories. It was becoming a data set, one that held a mirror to our own complex world, asking a silent, urgent question about the patterns we might be repeating today. The Earth bears scars, a silent testament to the civilizations it has borne and buried. In the valleys and on the slopes, a story of strain is etched into the soil itself. Where woodlands once stood, erosion carves deep wounds, stripping the hillsides bare, revealing a land under immense stress. This is the first stream of evidence, the planet's own chronicle of human ambition. In the dust of Mesopotamia and across the sprawling heartland of Angkor, the skeletal remains of canals, dikes, and reservoirs crisscross the landscape. They are monuments to an immense hydraulic effort, a desperate struggle to command the flow of water. But nearby, the soil tells a darker tale. Ancient fields, now white with salt, poisoned by the very systems designed to give them life. This evidence bore silent witness to how relentlessly farmers pushed their world to the absolute edge of its capacity. Taken together, these clues, the vanishing forests, the intensity of cultivation, the wearing down of the ground itself, form a geological record of human endeavor and its ultimate cost. A second out the detritus of daily life. They count the foundations of houses, measure the sprawl of settlements, and peel back the layers of accumulated trash. From these humble remains, they can estimate the sheer number of souls who lived and died in a city or a region through the ages. Where the written word survives, the picture sharpens. In the provinces of the Roman world, or the courts of ancient Asian states, historians decipher the whispers of the past. They interrogate tax lists and legal complaints, tracing the fortunes of the common worker. They ask a simple, timeless question: could an ordinary family keep up with the relentless rise of prices and the ever-increasing demands of the state? The stark arithmetic of inequality is written in the earth of the graveyard. The modest size of most graves stands in stark contrast to the opulence of a few, burials laden with rich goods, with the glint of gold and the gleam of luxury imports from half a world away. These silent disparities reveal the widening chasm between the elite and everyone else. From this data, a clear pattern emerges. tracking the inexorable rise and fall of social pressure, the tightening of a societal spring before it finally breaks. A third stream tracks the clenched fist of power and the spectre of violence. Scribes and chroniclers, with ink and reed, etched accounts of rebellion, of bitter civil wars, and of invasions from beyond the frontier. But the stones also speak. City walls, once symbols of strength, are hastily thickened and reinforced, or they are abandoned altogether, their gates left open to the wind. Forts that once bristled with soldiers on distant borders fall silent, their garrisons vanishing into memory. The machinery of the state itself reveals its desperation, as tax systems are revised again and again, each new law an attempt to squeeze more sustenance from a tired and depleted base. This frantic activity can be coded, quantified. The number of internal conflicts reported within a given span of years, the frequency with which a ruling dynasty was overthrown. These measures provide a stark reading of the fragility of a state's core institutions at any given moment in time. No single one of these streams tells the whole story. A single tree ring cannot speak of a tax revolt. A fractured canal carries no memory of the farmer's rage. A king list, with its sterile succession of names, reveals nothing of the health of a forest. They are disparate whispers from a distant past. But once the data has been meticulously cleaned, standardized, and placed upon the same scale, a new form of intelligence can begin to listen. It can hear these whispers not as isolated noises, but as different instruments in the same vast, complex orchestra of a civilization. The crucial maneuver is a profound shift in perspective. Time is not tracked from a civilization's birth, but from the precipice of its dissolution. For each society in the sample, the research team identifies a final moment when the old central system, however weakened, is still recognizably in place. That moment becomes year zero. From that precipice, the model looks backward, stepping century by century into the past, sometimes for 200 or 300 years. It traces the intersecting trajectories of climate, of land use, of inequality, and of state power as they rise and fall on their approach to this terminal point. After this process is repeated for case after case, these aligned histories can be stacked one upon the other, and in that moment, something extraordinary happens. The machine no longer sees the singular tragedy of Rome, or the unique decay of the Maya, or the specific collapse of Angkor. It sees a vast, shimmering cloud of overlapping paths, a confluence of histories, all flowing toward the same kind of endpoint. The individual stories dissolve, replaced by the recognition of a deeper, universal pattern, a rhythm of growth, strain, and collapse that echoes through the ages. The past ceases to be a collection of tales and becomes a unified field of data, holding within it the fundamental laws that govern the rise and fall of worlds. Beneath the chaos of history, a hidden rhythm, a pulse beating to the same sequence of numbers, shaping the destiny of empires. To decipher this code, the analytical engine was not only fed the stories of ruin, but also the tales of survival, societies that stood at the precipice of collapse, yet did not fall. One crucial example emerged from the dawn of civilization in the Americas. We travel back in time to the arid central coast of what is now Peru, to the sacred city of Caral. Here, long before the Inca, a sophisticated culture raised monumental pyramids and ceremonial plazas, orchestrating a complex society across a network of settlements. But around 4,200 years ago, the skies fell silent. The rains failed. A mega-drought, born of a vast climatic shift that crippled other nascent states, descended upon the region. It was a pressure test of existential proportions. Where archaeologists expected to find the scars of civil war, the shattered pottery and burned temples of a society turning on itself, they found something else entirely. A great migration, not a great conflict. Instead of fighting over dwindling inland resources, communities methodically relocated. They moved toward the coast and the river valleys, places where the last vestiges of water and life could still be found. The vital trade routes, the arteries of their civilization, did not sever, they adapted. The flow of anchovies and shells from the sea, of cotton and goods from the inland farms, continued. The social contract held. More than that, they remembered. Murals and monoliths from this era carry a stark message, a warning etched in stone about the fickle nature of the climate and the profound necessity of managing resources with care. They were a people acutely aware of their own fragility. When these fragments of survival, the demographic shifts, the unbroken trade links, the cultural warnings, were converted into data, the profile of Caral looked radically different from a classic collapse. The climate graphs still showed the brutal vertical drop into aridity. Settlements were indeed abandoned. Yet the markers for internal violence remained stubbornly low. The evidence for long-distance exchange and social cohesion persisted. The pattern of life was irrevocably altered, but the fundamental fabric of their world did not tear. For the researchers, Caral became the indispensable contrast case, a near miss. It was the control group in history's great chaotic experiment, marking the boundary between breakdown and adaptation. With this boundary case illuminating the edge, the central pattern came into sharper focus. The grand narrative of human civilization was no longer a collection of isolated tragedies or tales of random misfortune. It was a single, recurring story written in the language of data. A ghostly curve, an echo that appeared again and again in the coded records of the past, whether in the fall of Rome, the fragmentation of the Maya, or the decline of the Indus Valley. Certain variables would rise in concert, others would stall, and then, inevitably, a harsh shock would strike a system already trembling under its own weight. The precise shape of that curve, its terrible and beautiful geometry, could only be seen by tracing the life cycle of these civilizations, one by one. When the great collapses of history are set side by side, they cease to be accidents. They become a process. The names, the gods, and the weapons all change, but the underlying trajectory remains hauntingly the same. It is a chain of events with 5 distinct movements. First, the ascent. A period of explosive growth, a boom when a state consumes more land and energy, builds its monumental cities, and weaves an ever more intricate web of social and political complexity. Population swells, and the power of the center seems limitless. Then, the stratification. Terre élite. The burdens on the populace, in the form of taxes, debts, and labor, grow heavier, while their share of the prosperity diminishes. A dangerous gap opens between the lives of the rulers and the ruled. The third movement is strain. The society begins to exhaust its foundations. The land itself begins to tire. Forests recede, soils thin, rivers run low. The intricate trade routes that feed the core become stretched and fragile. The system consumes resources faster than they can be replenished, and the margins for error vanish. The society becomes brittle. And into this brittle, overstretched world comes the fourth horseman, the shock. It need not be a single, cataclysmic event. It is often a sustained pressure, a drought that will not break, a series of devastating crop failures, a new and relentless war on the frontiers, or the sudden crash of a vital trade network. It is the blow that a healthy, resilient society might absorb, but which a strained and unequal one cannot. The final act is the fracture. The intricate web of trust and obligation that holds a complex society together dissolves. Authority evaporates. The centers can no longer command the peripheries. Cities empty. Knowledge is lost. And life simplifies, often brutally. The great machine of civilization breaks apart into its smaller, simpler components. The names change, the empires turn to sand, but the curve remains. A 5-act tragedy etched into the deep code of complex societies. It is a pattern not of fate, but of consequence, a ghost from the past whispering a question to the present. Is this a trajectory we are doomed to repeat, or a lesson we are, at last, ready to learn? There is a cadence to collapse, a sequence ancient and unforgiving that echoes through the ruins of empires. It begins with a slow tightening, a period of mounting pressure on a society's foundations. This ISID condition is ill-equipped to endure. This is the strain. And last is the snap, the final brittle fracture, when old institutions fail to adapt and the entire structure breaks apart, draining away into the dust of history. Every civilization that has vanished from the earth have. Our chronicle begins in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, on the sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia. Here, Sargon of Akkad and his successors forged the world's first empire, a sprawling dominion of cities and farms stitched together across the lands that are now Iraq and its neighbors. Its lifeblood was water, drawn from the twin arteries of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Akkadians leaned on this water with the full weight of their ambition, pushing irrigated grain fields deep into the arid fringe lands, gambling against the desert for their prosperity. For a time, the boom seemed eternal. Clay tablets, silent witnesses to this age, speak of immense grain deliveries and rations flowing into the great urban centers. The royal court, flush with the wealth of a continent, poured tribute into magnificent temples and sprawling palaces. An empire's survival became inextricably tied to its engineering. The irrigation canals, a triumph of human ingenuity, were now a critical vulnerability. They had to be dug ever longer, maintained, and kept clear of silt across hundreds of miles of countryside. The fields in the risky, dry zones were no longer a surplus buffer. They had become an essential part of the daily food supply. Inequality began to etch deep lines into the social fabric. When water ran short or a vital canal choked with mud, the first to suffer were not the palace elites, but the small farmers and laborers on the periphery. A slow poison was also creeping into the earth itself. In fields where water was spread and evaporated century after century, salt began to build up in the soil, rendering it barren. The richest households and the powerful temple estates could always secure the most fertile plots, shifting the growing risk onto the shoulders of everyone else. The system was stretched, taut, its resilience wearing thin. Then came the strain, a climatic hammer blow from which there was no recovery. Evidence locked deep within sea cores and terrestrial records from across Southwest Asia reveals a ghostly signature. Around 4,200 years ago, the entire region descended into a long, merciless drought, an event now known as the 4.2 kilo-year event. The climate patterns shifted. Layers of dust in the geological record point to fiercer winter storms that choked the skies, while rainfall and river flows plummeted. This was not a localized crisis. The harvests would have failed not just in a single valley, but across the entire agricultural heartland that fed the empire. With its soils already exhausted and its irrigation network stretched to its absolute limit, there was no slack left. The shock pushed the system into its final phase. The snap, when it came, was not a single thunderclap, but a slow, grinding disintegration. Archaeological surveys in northern Mesopotamia show a landscape in retreat. Maps of human settlement begin to thin out as once bustling towns and villages were abandoned, their inhabitants vanishing from the record. Later texts, written from the fading memory of a golden age, speak of famine, of social chaos, of people wandering in search of food. The Akkadian Empire did not vanish in a single year. Rebellions and wars certainly hastened its demise. But the old central state, its authority broken by its failure to provide, never recovered its reach. Half a world away, and thousands of years later, the same inexorable sequence would unfold. Not in the arid plains of the Near East, but beneath the canopy of a relentless jungle. Between the 3rd and 9th centuries of the Common Era, the classic Maya civilization flourished in the lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula. In what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, city-states erected stepped pyramids that clawed at the sky, carved intricate stone monuments to their god-kings, and supported dense urban populations. Rival dynasties and monumental construction. Their squeeze was born of this very success. To feed their people and fund their ambitions, they practiced a form of intensive agriculture that reshaped the landscape, clearing vast tracts of jungle for maize cultivation. But in a land with few navigable rivers, they too were utterly dependent on water, in this case, the seasonal rains. Their growing populations placed an enormous burden on the soil, while deforestation began to have measurable impacts on the local climate. The rivalry between kings drove them to demand ever greater tribute from their subjects and ever greater yields from their. The strain arrived as a series of devastating multi-decade droughts during the 9th and 10th centuries. Sediment cores from the region's lakes show that the life-giving summer rains repeatedly failed. The sophisticated reservoirs and water management systems of the Maya cities, designed for seasonal dry spells, could not withstand years upon years of crippling water shortage. As the crops withered and the reservoirs turned to cracked mud, the foundation of Maya kingship began to crumble. These rulers were not mere administrators. They were divine intermediaries, whose rituals were meant to ensure the favor of the gods and the coming of the rain. When the rains failed, so too did their authority. The snap was a cascade of political and social collapse. The city-states fractured. Endemic warfare, always a feature of Maya politics, intensified into a desperate struggle for survival, and one by one, the great southern cities were abandoned. Their people melted away into the jungle, their stone monuments left to be consumed by vines, their grand plazas silenced. The ghosts of Akkad and Tikal do not tell a story of sudden catastrophe, but of a slow internal unraveling, made fatal by a final external shock. They reveal that civilizations are not permanent fixtures of the landscape. They are complex, energy-hungry systems, and their very complexity creates the vulnerabilities that can lead to their undoing. The patterns of the past are not prophecies, but they are a timeless, cautionary echo, a reminder that the foundations of any world, no matter how grand, are never as solid as they appear. A civilization carved from the jungle, its power asserted through the clash of obsidian blades, the smoke of elaborate ritual, and the delicate threads of alliance. This was the great flourishing of the Maya. A boom phase etched itself across the landscape in the rapid spread of cities, their plazas dominated by monuments that screamed the triumphs of royal dynasties. Around these urban hearts, a transformation was underway. Farmers, driven by an insatiable demand, waged their own war against the forest. They cleared vast tracts of ancient canopy, sculpted mountainsides into intricate terraces, and engineered raised fields, turning seasonal wetlands into relentless engines of food production. But this golden age was built on the knife's edge. The squeeze was tightening, its pressure falling hardest on the common people and the land that sustained them. The forest cover receded year by year as more trees were felled for the cooking fires of the cities, for the lime plaster of the temples, for the opening of yet more agricultural plots. Thin, fragile soils on the hillsides, never intended for intensive cultivation, were brought under the plow. While noble families poured immense resources and human labor into prestige projects, towering pyramids, opulent court life, and incessant warfare for status, the farmers bore the true burden. They were tasked with keeping the river of food flowing into the cities, with paying tribute from their meager harvests, and, when the drums sounded, with serving as foot soldiers in their lord's endless conflicts. When the rains faltered and the harvest dipped, the elite households had storehouses to draw from and trade connections to exploit. Those at the bottom, the foundation of the entire pyramid, had no such buffer. Their margin for a bad year grew thinner, then vanished entirely. And as the pressure mounted on the living, a silent record of their fate was being written in stone, deep beneath the earth. New science has illuminated the final strain and the terminal shocks with terrifying clarity. From a cave near the modern town of Tico in the northwest Yucatan, a single stalagmite has offered its testimony. Growing drip by drip over millennia, it captured the chemical signature of wet season rainfall, year by painstaking year, between the late 9th and early 11th centuries of the Common Era. In a study published in the year 2025, researchers unveiled its chronicle. The calcite record revealed 8 severe droughts during the terminal Classic period. Each one of these dry spells lasted for at least 3 years. One stretched for an agonizing 13 years, a relentless siege of thirst with only the briefest of respites. For a people already farming at the absolute limits of their capacity, this was a death sentence for the fields. It meant repeated total crop failure. The snap is written into the stones of the cities themselves. Across the lowlands, the chisels of the scribes fall silent. The carving of dated monuments, the very heartbeat of Maya political life, ceases abruptly during and after these droughts. Instead, archaeologists find the grim evidence of desperation. Hastily constructed defensive walls, the charcoal scars of widespread burning, and then the final, silent layers of abandon of the most extreme droughts. Others, such as the great cosmopolitan hub of Chichen Itza, remained active, Ford prestige goods, maintaining a veneer of power while its neighbors crumbled. The climate stress did not act alone. It was the final, unanswerable blow that landed upon a system already fractured by intense elite competition and a critically overstrained agricultural base. The boom and the squeeze had set the stage. The droughts provided the shock. This pattern, this tragic feedback loop of ambition, environmental strain, and climatic shock is not unique. Far across the world, in what is now Cambodia, the Khmer Empire of Angkor demonstrates how even the most brilliant engineering can become a gilded cage. For centuries, the Khmer built one of the largest pre-industrial urban complexes on Earth, a hydraulic city designed to tame the monsoon. A dense grid of canals, embankments, and colossal reservoirs, known as barays, stored the torrential wet season rains, feeding a stable supply of water to the rice paddies. It was a masterpiece of control, an empire built on the mastery of water. Yet it too would ultimately face its own reckoning. The ghosts of Angkor and Tikal whisper a timeless lesson: that the foundations of any society, no matter how monumental its achievements, are inextricably linked to the resilience of the world that supports it. The illusion of permanence, carved in stone and engineered with genius, can be shattered by forces both of our own making and those far beyond our control, reminding us that the line between a golden age and its twilight is often finer than we dare to imagine. In the heart of the Khmer Empire, life was dictated by the rhythm of water. During the parched months, the sun baked the earth, and the great Tonle Sap Lake receded. But this was no crisis. It was an opportunity, harnessed by an engineering marvel that defined a civilization. This was the boom phase of Angkor, built not just of sandstone, but of water itself. An intricate circulatory system of canals, dikes, and vast reservoirs, known as barays, formed a hydraulic machine of unprecedented scale. It captured the monsoon's deluge and redistributed it with breathtaking precision, transforming the landscape into a vast, fertile chessboard of rice paddies. This mastery over water yielded a colossal surplus of rice, the currency of power. It fed a burgeoning population, sustained a lavish royal court, and funded an army of artisans and laborers. From this wealth, stone itself seemed to blossom into divinity, epic battles, a testament to a kingdom at the zenith of its confidence, a society that believed it had tamed nature itself. Yet, over centuries, the very success of this system began to tighten its grip. Each new canal, each additional control structure, was another artery in an increasingly complex body, another point of potential failure requiring constant maintenance. To feed the machine and its people, the great forests that ringed the capital were relentlessly cleared, felled for timber, and to make way for yet more fields. Without the anchoring roots of the trees, the monsoon rains, once a blessing, now washed tons of soil into the waterways. Erosion began to choke the empire's lifeblood with sediment. The water network, once a symbol of ingenuity, was becoming a brittle giant. As its complexity grew, so too did its inertia. It became harder to repair and almost impossible to fundamentally redesign. For the rulers and the elite, status and legitimacy were derived from their stewardship of this immense public work. The impulse was always to expand, to add another layer of complexity, rather than to simplify or adapt. The wealth and power of Angkor now rested upon a foundation that was as impressive as it was profoundly fragile. Then the world changed. Deep within the forests of the surrounding highlands, ancient trees held a silent record of the sky. Their rings, a patient chronicle of the centuries, reveal a dramatic shift beginning in the 14th century. The predictable cycle of monsoon and drought gave way to a period of violent climatic convulsions. A 750-year record, painstakingly assembled, points to two droughts of exceptional ferocity, one in the mid-14th century, the other in the early 15th. These were not mere dry spells. They were decades-long sieges of thirst, broken only by sudden, furious bursts of torrential rain. This was the shock. The intricate network of canals, engineered for a stable and predictable climate, was suddenly assaulted by forces it was never designed to withstand. Models of Angkor's hydraulic system reveal a catastrophic tipping point. Once floodwaters rose past a certain level, the failure would cascade. Embankments would breach, and the deluge would scour new, uncontrollable channels through the landscape, tearing the carefully balanced network to pieces. The scient music of this new climate, the struggle to maintain it, became a losing battle. Geoarchaeological work from within the city walls tells a story of desperation. We see channels choked with silt, evidence of repeated, frantic recutting, and then, finally, abandonment. This was not a system undergoing smooth upkeep, but one suffering a slow, agonizing death. Throughout the 15th century, the center of political gravity began to shift. Power ebbed away from the great inland capital, flowing south towards river ports closer to the sea, near the site of modern-day Phnom Penh. Angkor did not fall to a single climactic siege. There was no final heroic battle among its temples. It was simply left behind. Its magnificent water system and the rigid political order built upon it, incapable of adapting to the dual shocks of a volatile climate and the pull of new maritime trade. This pattern of a complex society becoming a victim of its own success is a story written across history. Half a world away, a different empire traced a similar arc of ascent and decay. For centuries, Rome grew relentlessly from a small city-state into a dominion stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the sands of North Africa. Its boom was fueled by conquest and taxation, funding a vast professional army and a network of cities linked by stone-paved roads and maritime superhighways. This wealth built a world of stone and marble, towns graced with public baths, forums and arenas, while colossal shipments of grain fed urban masses who no longer tilled the soil. But beneath the surface of this imperial peace, a generational squeeze was tightening. Slowly, inexorably, land ownership consolidated into the hands of a tiny, hyper-wealthy elite. The small, independent farmer, the traditional backbone of the Republic and early empire, was gradually replaced by vast, slave-run estates. This internal corrosion hollowed out the very structures that had made the empire strong, creating a society of profound inequality, hidden behind a facade of monumental architecture and military might. The intricate systems that fed the cities and armed the legions depended on a social and economic order that was itself becoming dangerously brittle. In the end, both Angkor and Rome tell the same cautionary tale. They show us that the architecture of power, whether built of water or of legions, can become a prison. The very systems that enable growth and project strength can, through their own complexity and rigidity, lose the capacity to change. They become too invested in their own methods, too blinded by their past successes, to adapt when the world outside their walls presents a challenge they have never seen before. History is not merely a record of collapse, but a quiet warning that the greatest threat to a civilization is often the unquestioning belief in its own permanence. The heartland of the Roman world was a landscape of stark contrasts. On one side, vast estates, the latifundia, spread across the horizon, their fields worked by armies of tenants and slaves, their profits flowing to a handful of powerful families. On the other, the smallholder, the traditional backbone of the Republic, was being systematically crushed. Squeezed by mounting debts, exorbitant rents, and the relentless demands of the tax collector, countless free farmers lost their ancestral lands. Many became mere tenants on the very estates that had consumed their heritage, while others drifted towards the cities, swelling the ranks of a restive, impoverished urban populace. Beneath the surface of imperial grandeur, a dangerous structural imbalance was taking hold. The number of people aspiring to the privileges of the elite was growing far faster than the number of actual positions of power the system could offer. This process, a form of elite overproduction, created a fiercely competitive and unstable upper class, a legion of ambitious men all vying for a finite number of senatorial seats, governorships, and military commands. Simultaneously, for the common worker, the real value of their labor began a long, slow decline. To sustain the sprawling military and the gilded life of the court, the imperial tax system had to press ever harder on the countryside, extracting the wealth that kept the legions paid and the palaces gleaming. The vast machinery of the state still ground on, but its margin for error, its resilience to crisis, had shrunk to a perilous sliver. The strain was building from within and without. Then came the shocks. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, invisible invaders swept through the arteries of the empire. Great plagues, known to history as the Antonine and the Cyprian, scythed through the population. They emptied towns, left fields fallow, and gutted the tax base. Critically, they thinned the ranks of the army, making recruitment a desperate and constant struggle. At this very moment of biological vulnerability, the political order began to fracture. Civil wars between rival claimants to the throne, once a sporadic illness, became a chronic condition. To secure the loyalty of the legions, the ultimate arbiters of power, emperors were forced to offer ever larger donatives and higher wages. They often turned a blind eye as soldiers and local commanders took what they needed from provincial populations, deepening the economic squeeze on the very people the army was meant to protect. Along the far-flung frontiers, the cost of defense spiraled upwards. The Rhine and Danube, once stable borders, were now simmering with pressure, demanding more men, more forts, and more gold, just as the empire's ability to provide them was weakening. 4th centuries, the tremors gave way to a cataclysm. Emperors rose and fell in a bloody carousel of assassination and battlefield death. The legions, the shield of Rome, turned their swords inward, fighting each other for the right to name the next ruler, while the borders were left dangerously exposed. Into this vacuum poured Eurasian steppe, crossed the frontiers. They came not just as invaders, but as refugees and mercenaries, complex forces the fracturing empire could neither fully defeat nor successfully assimilate. Decisive moments on the battlefield revealed the stark new reality. At the Battle of Adrianople, a Roman emperor was slain and his army annihilated by Gothic cavalry, shattering the long-held myth of the legion's invincibility. The old balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The consequences were brutal and immediate. Cities were sacked, entire regions were devastated, and vast territories were lost to imperial control forever. The final snap was not a singular event, not one dramatic fall, but a drawn-out, agonizing loss of central authority in the West. The intricate systems that held the empire together simply broke down. Tax collection failed in province after province. The currency, debased by desperate emperors to pay their troops, lost its value, strangling long-distance trade. Power atomized, shifting from the distant emperor to local strongmen. Great landowners, masters of the latifundia, became the de facto rulers of their domains. Maintaining Taeboi Romulus Augustulus was quietly deposed in the late 5th century. The imperial state in the West was already a ghost. The institution he represented had fractured into a patchwork of successor kingdoms. The legacy of Rome would endure, carried forward in law, in language, and in faith. But the immense, unifying political and economic system that had bound 3 continents together for centuries could no longer support its own immense weight. This pattern of a society pressing against its limits until it breaks repeats itself even on the smallest of scales, on the harshest edges of the known world. In the late 10th century, Norse settlers from Iceland and Norway established a remote outpost on the southwest coast of Greenland. They created 2 main settlements where they painstakingly recreated the life they had left behind. They brought cattle, sheep, and goats to a land ill-suited for them. They built sturdy stone farmhouses and churches to honor their god. For a time, they thrived, tying themselves into the great trade routes of Europe, sending precious walrus ivory and rope back to the continent. They were a tiny, isolated fragment of European civilization, clinging to a sliver of green on the edge of an impassable ice sheet. They too had built a complex society with brittle foundations, a world whose survival depended on a stable climate and a connection to a homeland that would, in time, forget them. Whether in the heart of a sprawling empire or on the frozen fringe of the world, the story is the same. A society is only as resilient as the foundations upon which it is built. When those foundations crack, even the mightiest structures are destined to return to the earth. On the very fringe of the known world, a society took root. Here, at the edge of a colossal ice sheet, Norse settlers carved out a life, a thin ribbon of green clinging to the unforgiving coastline of Greenland. For a few centuries they endured, trading the white gold of the Arctic, walrus ivory, and other precious goods to a distant Europe. In return came the essentials they could not produce: iron for tools to work the unforgiving land, and timber to build and repair the ships that were their only lifeline. Theirs was never an empire to rival Rome. It was a modest, tenacious foothold, a Christian farming society sustained by faith and sheer will in a place of immense cold and isolation. Yet from its very inception, this world was built upon a knife's edge. The fundamental strains of survival were woven into the fabric of their daily existence. Their farms were established at the absolute limit of what the northern climate would permit for the growth of grass, the lifeblood of their livestock. To feed their cattle and sheep, the Norse colonists cleared the native scrubland and dwarf forests, exposing fragile soils to the relentless Greenlandic winds. The price of this existence was paid in the soil itself. The silent testimony of the lake beds, read through core samples of sediment, tells a slow, steady bleeding of the very land that sustained them. Their vulnerability was twofold. They were utterly dependent on the stability of a local climate that was never truly stable, and equally reliant on long, treacherous sea routes for vital supplies and the whims of faraway markets. This delicate balance could not hold. As the centuries wore on, the climate began to turn against them. Scientific studies of North Atlantic temperatures and ancient ice cores reveal a grim shift. Beginning in the 14th century, a creeping cold descended. This was the dawn of the Little Ice Age, a global phenomenon that felt intensely personal in Greenland. The winds grew fiercer, the storms more frequent. Sea ice choked the fjords for longer stretches of the year, imprisoning ships and isolating communities. The growing seasons, already perilously short, began to shrink. As the ice advanced, the world retreated. In Europe, new trade routes opened to Africa, bringing a flood of elephant ivory to the continent. The demand for the walrus tusks from Greenland plummeted. The colony's primary source of income, their one great bargaining chip with the outside world, was rendered nearly worthless. The chemical whispers left in their very bones reveal the consequence of this mounting pressure. Isotope analysis of Norse skeletons shows a slow, desperate change in diet over time. The signature of land-based animals faded, replaced by the unmistakable markers of the sea. They were eating more seals, turning away from their failing farms and leaning ever more heavily on the hunt. The safety margin, always thin, was narrowing to nothing. The final collapse was not a single catastrophic event, but a cascade of failures, a pile of hits from which there was no recovery. The regular cargo ship from Norway, the colony's umbilical cord to civilization, seems to have stopped arriving sometime in the late 14th century. One of the last known vessels to attempt the route sank and was never replaced. A ghost fleet, a connection severed. Far away in Europe, the Black Death and subsequent crises were tearing the heart out of their Norwegian patrons, weakening the kingdom that had once overseen and supported the Greenlandic settlements. There was no one left with the resources, or perhaps the will, to send aid. We have a haunting eyewitness account from this period of decline. A Norwegian priest, Ivor Bartharsson, dispatched to the colony in the mid-14th century, sailed to the western settlement, one of the two main areas of Norse habitation. He found it utterly deserted. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, only an eerie silence and the stray, untended livestock wandering through the empty fields. It was a community that had simply vanished. By the 15th century, the evidence from the graveyards becomes undeniable. Skeletons unearthed at Herjolfsnes in the eastern settlement are smaller, their bones bearing the telltale marks of malnutrition and chronic stress. These were the remains of a people worn down by generations of hardship. There was no final, recorded last stand, no heroic battle against the elements. The Norse presence in Greenland simply faded out over the course of the 15th century. It was a slow, quiet snapping of a thread stretched too thin for too long. Farms were abandoned to the encroaching scrub. Churches, once the stone and turf heart of their communities, fell silent, their bells no longer calling the faithful to prayer across the cold, empty valleys. The last of the population, a people who had crossed the world's most dangerous ocean to build a new life, either perished in isolation or packed what little they had and sailed away, leaving no record of their departure. They became a ghost story, a mystery whispered on the edge of the medieval map. The patterns of the past are not confined to the past. They are templates, echoes that reverberate through the ages. The long boom has happened. We have built a civilization of staggering complexity, of immense cities, and a web of global connection that would have been unimaginable to any empire of antiquity. But the fundamental laws of cause and effect, of resource and consequence, remain unchanged. The story of the Greenland Norse is a cautionary tale written in ice and bone, a stark reminder that even the most resilient societies are fragile systems, vulnerable to the convergence of environmental change and economic shock. The question is not whether we are on the same curve that brought older civilizations to their knees, but where. The old histories speak of a recurring curve, a pattern of growth and fracture that appears again and again in the chronicles of fallen empires. The question that haunts our modern age is where we now stand on that familiar trajectory, and whether the ground beneath our feet is sliding toward the same kind of precipice. In March of 2021, a single steel behemoth, a container ship wedged sideways in the sands of the Suez Canal, brought the world to a standstill. For 6 days, a vital artery of global commerce was severed. The cost was measured in billions of dollars for every 24 hours of paralysis. One ship, one canal, a world held hostage. It was a stark and sudden revelation of a fundamental truth about our time. We have built a single, giant, interconnected system that now spans the entire Earth. Nearly 8 billion people live inside this planetary machine, inextricably tied together by ceaseless currents of trade, fuel, food, capital, and data. The consequence is a system of radical interdependence, where a factory shuttered in one hemisphere can trigger a spike in food prices in another, where a tremor in one market can send shockwaves through all the others. This is the modern expression of the historic boom, a phase of staggering complexity, unprecedented output, and a perilous dependence on long, fragile chains of causality that no single entity, no government, no corporation truly controls. But within this intricate architecture, deep fractures have begun to form. The squeeze, that ancient pattern of concentration, is now playing out on a global scale. The wealthiest 1% of the human population now command close to half of all global wealth. They have captured the vast majority of all new wealth generated in recent years, creating a chasm between the few and the many. At the same time, a great and growing cohort of millions of young, educated, and ambitious people from every nation finds itself chasing a dwindling number of high-status, securely unequal systems are inherently fragile. Their stability depends upon an ever tighter grip on the distribution of food, the application of force, and the movement of people. They are systems that can hold together under immense pressure until, suddenly, they cannot. They can come apart with astonishing speed. This immense social pressure is matched by a strain written into the very fabric of the planet itself. Of the 9 critical Earth systems that for millennia provided the stable backdrop for human civilization, 6 have now been pushed beyond their safe operating boundaries. The delicate balance of our climate, the rich tapestry of biodiversity, the integrity of our land use, the purity of our fresh water, the pervasive spread of novel chemical pollution, and the overwhelming cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus washing from our farms into our rivers. More recent assessments suggest a seventh boundary. The fundamental chemistry of the oceans may now be crossed or stands perilously close to the brink. In the simplest terms, the biophysical foundation that provides our food, our water, and our predictable weather is buckling. At the very moment, our global society has become more complex, more rigid, and more tightly linked than ever before. The story of water is a microcosm of this global predicament. Data from NASA satellites, confirmed by subsequent studies, reveals a hidden crisis unfolding beneath our feet. Many of the world's great subterranean aquifers, the ancient reservoirs of fresh water that sustain critical agricultural regions, are being drained far faster than nature can replenish them. In the arid bread baskets that export food to the rest of the world, farmers are pumping what is effectively fossil water, a resource that will not return in this century, or perhaps ever. One analysis from Columbia University described this relentless groundwater overuse as a hidden risk for the global food system. The danger is not abstract. When these aquifers finally run dry, the food shocks that begin in one region will not be contained there. They will propagate instantly through the network of global trade, sparking crises thousands of miles away. We have already seen glimpses of what happens when this environmental strain collides with weak or brittle institutions. These are the shock clusters of the 21st century. In Syria, a historic, climate change-amplified drought, the worst in the nation's recorded history, decimated harvests and drove over 1 million farmers from their land into the peripheries of already overcrowded cities. There, they met unemployment, inequality, and a rigid political system incapable of response. The strain on the land converged with the squeeze on the people, and the result was a society breaking apart. We look at the intricate marvel we have built and see its power, its speed, its sheer productive capacity. But the old histories whisper a different story. They speak of systems that grew too complex, too unequal, too demanding of the earth that sustained them. They remind us that the curve of progress can, without warning, become the arc of descent. Our civilization is the first to possess the knowledge to see the pattern in its entirety, to understand the forces now converging. The question is not whether the storm is coming, but whether that knowledge can offer a different path, one that diverges from the well-trodden road to ruin. The story begins not with the thunder of armies, but with the silence of a cracked and barren earth. In the heartlands of the Middle East, a stretch of severe drought, beginning in the mid-2000s and lasting for nearly a decade, descended upon agricultural regions already buckling under the strain of misguided water policy and dwindling state support. Fields that had sustained generations turned to dust. Scientific studies now draw a clear and ominous line from this new, relentless aridity to the changing global climate. As the harvests failed, year after agonizing year, a silent exodus began. Rural families, their livelihoods erased, were pushed toward the cities in a desperate search for survival. This mass migration swelled urban centers just before the eruption of a wider, more violent conflict, transforming environmental stress into a critical component of a devastating civil war. This was not an isolated phenomenon. Far away, in the vast landscapes of Darfur, United Nations reports had long chronicled a similar tragic convergence. Here, the degradation of the land, the inexorable spread of the desert, and the fierce competition over shrinking oases and precious grazing lands poured fuel onto the embers of ethnic and political tension. These are not yet the narratives of full global collapse. Instead, they resemble localized, accelerated runs of the same historical curve. A long period of mounting strain punctuate. Today, the specter of hunger and conflict across wider regions reveals the same volatile mixture. The World Food Programme issues stark warnings that tens of millions of people in Western and Central Africa now face dire food shortages. This is not the result of a single cause, but a perfect storm of interlocking crises: violent conflict, soaring food prices, and extreme weather events hammering the same vulnerable populations all at once. Joint early warning reports from the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Programme paint a grim cartography of human suffering. The reason is the terrifying arithmetic of modern catastrophe, where war, economic crashes, and climate shocks stack one on top of another, creating a weight that no society can bear. This is the face of a stressed global system, a world trembling on the edge of a full break. It is not one great singular fall, but a cascade of many regional crises, each one a test of how much support and flexibility the wider international system truly possesses. But where the story of our time diverges from the annals of history is in the layers of risk no ancient empire could have conceived. Organizations that meticulously track the world's most dangerous weapons estimate there are now approximately 12,000 nuclear warheads on Earth. Of these, around 9,000 are held in active military stockpiles, and of those, about 2,000 are kept on high alert by the United States and Russia. A silent, hair-trigger standoff. Several nuclear-armed states are actively modernizing or expanding their arsenals, raising the stakes of any large-scale conflict to a level of existential threat that never troubled the forums of Rome or the temples of Angkor. At the other end of the scale, in the quiet of the laboratory, humanity now wields powerful tools in biology and genetics, capable of altering the very code of life. While these fields are overwhelmingly dedicated to curing disease and bettering the human condition, they also inadvertently create new pathways for catastrophic accident or deliberate misuse. A pathogen, whether accidental or engineered, could now traverse the globe in the time it takes a jetliner to cross an ocean, spreading across borders with a speed that would outpace any ancient plague. And then there is the invisible architecture that binds it all together, the digital layer that underpins the modern boom. This network, our greatest asset, can also become our greatest vulnerability, capable of transmitting sudden, paralyzing shocks. In the year 2021, a single ransomware attack forced the Colonial Pipeline Company in the United States to shut down. Roughly 5,500 miles of vital fuel pipeline went dark for several days, severing gasoline supplies across large swathes of the nation's east coast. The disruption, caused by one company in one country for less than 1 week, still triggered fuel shortages, panic buying, and widespread economic concern. It was a stark demonstration of a new reality. As energy experts point out, the arteries of modern commerce, the power grids, the pipelines, the shipping ports, are perilously fragile. More such, and still. The great lesson is not that systems fall, for they always have. It is that our own system, global in scale and digital in nature, is bound by threads of immense power and unprecedented fragility. We have built a world of breathtaking complexity, yet we have not fully reckoned with the possibility that its most intricate connections may also be its most profound vulnerabilities. The shocks of the past arrived with the rumble of armies or the slow, agonizing creep of famine. But the new cataclysms arrive in silence and with blinding speed. This is the modern paradigm of shock, a threat that is not merely physical, but ethereal. It is no longer confined to the parched earth of a drought or the chaos of open conflict. It is a digital strike, a cascade of corrupted data that can paralyze the very architecture we engineered to make life smoother. The intricate web of global finance, the power grids that illuminate our cities, the supply chains that feed our populations, all are tethered to a fragile digital reality. In our quest for a frictionless world, we may have inadvertently engineered our own most profound vulnerability.